The average wedding today costs somewhere north of $30,000, involves a color-coordinated seating chart, and culminates in the single most legally significant act of the entire day. A piece of paper being signed by a county employee nobody at the party has ever met, which is odd when you consider that for most of human history, the paperwork was the wedding, and the party was the optional part. We have successfully inverted the whole institution. We kept the cake and outsourced the contract to a woman named Denise, who works Tuesdays through Saturdays, and does not care about your color palette. So what did ancient human weddings actually look like? And I should warn you up front, the honest answer to that question is going to spend a lot of time being, we're not entirely sure, which is the archaeological equivalent of a shrug in a lab coat. Let's start by throwing out the answers you've already heard. There's the cartoon version, where a caveman clubs a woman and drags her home by the hair, which is not an artifact of prehistory but an artifact of the 1860s, when a Scottish lawyer named John McLennan decided that all marriage originally began with kidnapping, and everyone thought that was a delightful theory. There's the version where every ancient wedding was a father calmly trading his daughter to a neighboring family for 11 goats and a defensible hilltop. And then there's the folklore layer, bridesmaids dressed identically to confuse evil spirits, the best man standing by as armed backup in case the bride's relatives showed up swinging, the honeymoon being a month of drinking mead until the bride was pregnant or at least agreeable. Every one of these has a fantastic origin story. Almost every one of those origin stories was invented by a Victorian folklorist who really wanted there to be a fantastic origin story. The real answer is stranger, older, and considerably more bureaucratic. Because before you can have a wedding, you need something much weirder than a ceremony. You need a species that requires other people to acknowledge a relationship in order for that relationship to function. Consider the biology first. Human infants are, by primate standards, an engineering disaster. They arrive early, helpless, and neurologically unfinished, and they stay expensive for well over a decade. In forager societies, a child typically does not produce as many calories as it consumes until sometime in its late teens. No mother, anywhere, at any point in human history has raised one of these alone. Human reproduction is a group project with terrible group project dynamics. Over the last few million years, our lineage drifted towards smaller differences in body size between males and females, longer-term pair bonds than our closest relatives maintain, and an extraordinary reliance on what anthropologists call alloparenting. Grandmothers, aunts, older siblings, and various loosely committed adults, all feeding the same small screaming person. But here's the thing. Pair bonding is not marriage. Gibbons pair bond, prairie voles pair bond, and are extremely smug about it. What no gibbon has ever needed is for its uncle to formally recognize the relationship so that a dispute about fruit trees can be resolved in the next generation. Marriage isn't a bond between two people. Marriage is a bond between two people that third parties agree to be bound by. It's the difference between a promise and a registered claim. Marriage, in other words, was never really about the couple. The couple was the paperwork's excuse. For the vast majority of human existence, the roughly 300,000 years before anyone farmed anything, this recognition happened without any institution at all because there was no institution to have. Groups were small, mobile, and everyone knew everyone's entire history, including the parts they'd have preferred forgotten. In the forager societies anthropologists have documented, and I'll flag right now that living foragers are not time machines. They are modern people with modern histories, and using them as a window into the Pleistocene is a methodological sin we're going to commit carefully and with hedging. Marriage often had no ceremony worth the name. There was a period of gift exchange between families. There was frequently bride service, where a young man moved in with his in-laws and spent several years demonstrating that he could actually hunt, which is essentially a probationary employment period with your girlfriend's parents as your line managers. Sometimes there was ritualized resistance, where the bride made a show of objecting. Sometimes the couple just started sleeping in the same shelter, and everyone updated their mental records accordingly. Enforcement was pure social pressure, and social pressure in a group of 30 people is nuclear grade. Your reputation was your entire credit rating. It was maintained by gossip. And there was no way to move to a different city and start over, because there were no cities and the nearest other group already knew. Which brings us to Gary. Every group has a Gary. Gary promised 3 years of bride service and delivered 8 months. Gary's brother told everyone the antelope was Gary's contribution, when in fact Gary had been standing nearby, holding a stick, in a supportive capacity. In a band of 30 people, Gary is a manageable problem, because everyone can simply agree, silently and permanently, that Gary is not to be trusted with anything, and Gary's marital prospects collapse under the weight of a collective memory. The system works. The system is gossip. Then humans stopped moving. Farming did not immediately invent romance. It invented something far more dangerous, the estate. When your wealth is meat, wealth spoils in 3 days and gets shared because there's no alternative. When your wealth is a granary, a herd, and a specific rectangle of dirt that your family has been improving for 4 generations, wealth becomes something that must be transmitted. And the moment wealth becomes transmissible, the question of exactly whose children these are stops being a matter of curiosity and becomes a matter of law. Populations grew. Villages became towns. And in a town of 2,000 people, Gary can simply walk 4 streets over and start fresh, because nobody there has heard about the antelope. Gossip does not scale, so humans built something that does. We can actually watch this happening in the ground, which is the genuinely astonishing part. At Hazelton North, a Neolithic long cairn in the Cotswolds dated to roughly 3700 BCE, a 2021 ancient DNA study reconstructed a family tree spanning 5 generations from 27 buried individuals, the oldest family tree ever assembled. Descent ran through the men. The women who bore their children came from elsewhere and were, in most cases, buried elsewhere too. Nobody wrote down a wedding. But the shape of a marriage system is sitting right there in the genome, roughly 5,500 years old. At Eulau in Germany, around 2600 BCE, corded ware burials preserved what appear to be nuclear families interred together, a mother, a father, their children, arranged facing one another. Strontium isotope analysis of their teeth, which records the geology of wherever a person spent childhood, showed the men and children were local and the women were not. The same pattern shows up in the Lechtal Valley of Bavaria, where isotope work across roughly 700 years of Bronze Age burials found generation after generation of non-local women marrying into local families. This is female exogamy and patriarchality, running like a metronome for centuries. And then writing shows up, and the story gets so much more specific it's almost uncomfortable. Mesopotamian marriage was a contract, in the fully unromantic legal sense. The groom's family transferred terhatum, bride wealth, to the bride's family. The bride brought a dowry, itemized. Law 128 of the Code of Hammurabi, dated to roughly 1754 BCE, states with beautiful bluntness that if a man takes a wife and does not draw up a contract, that woman is not a wife. Not the marriage is discouraged. Not please consider filing. She is simply, categorically, not a wife. The oldest surviving marriage law in human history is fundamentally a terms of service agreement, and Hammurabi's position is that if you didn't click accept, you don't have an account. Ancient Egypt, meanwhile, has left us essentially no evidence of a wedding ceremony at all. No rite, no officiant, no liturgy. What it left us instead, mostly from the first millennium BCE onward, are documents historians sometimes call annuity contracts. Agreements specifying what the wife brought, what she was owed, and what she'd be paid if the whole thing dissolved. 4,000 years ago, in the shadow of the pyramids, the enduring documentary legacy of Egyptian marriage is the prenup. And here is where the story gets messy, because we can see that marriage systems existed. We can see the isotopes, the genomes, the tablets. What we cannot see is why. Was marriage fundamentally an alliance technology? The mechanism Claude Lévi-Strauss famously argued lets separate groups bind themselves together through the exchange of people, converting potential enemies into in-laws you're obligated to help at harvest? Was it fundamentally about property, a paternity certainty machine bolted on after agriculture made inheritance worth fighting over? Was it about pooling labor to raise those absurdly expensive children, a childcare cooperative that acquired ceremonial trim? Or was it, more cynically, an elite invention, a strategy for consolidating land and status among a small number of powerful families that everyone else eventually copied, the way ordinary people now copy the wedding aesthetics of people who own helicopters? Archaeology can tell us where a woman grew up. It can tell us who she was related to and who she was buried beside. It cannot tell us whether she wanted to be there. It can tell us a contract was signed in Nippur in 1800 BCE. It cannot tell us whether the couple liked each other, whether anyone cried, whether there was music, or whether Gary showed up uninvited and drank a startling amount of beer. Archaeology, annoyingly, did not leave a sticky note explaining what any of this felt like. The honest answer is probably some combination of all of these, varying enormously by time, place, class, and how much land was involved. What we can trace clearly is what happened next, which is that marriage went corporate. Once it was a contract, it needed enforcement, and enforcement needed authority, and the highest available authority was always the same one. In Sumer, the union of the goddess Inanna and the shepherd Dumuzi was celebrated in hymns, and there's long-running scholarly debate about whether kings enacted some version of this rite with a priestess, the so-called sacred marriage, with the whole cosmos framed as running on a functioning partnership at the top. A king whose marriage mirrors the god's marriage is not merely wed. He's compliant with cosmic policy. It's exceptional branding. Rome formalized it further and, in typical Roman fashion, invented tiers. There was conferatio, the elite version, requiring 10 witnesses, a specific priest, and a cake made of spelt, an artisanal grain ceremony available only to patricians and famously difficult to get out of. There was coemptio, a symbolic purchase. And there was usus, in which a couple who simply lived together for a year were married by default, unless the wife spent 3 consecutive nights elsewhere, each year to reset the clock, which is the earliest known example of someone dodging an auto-renewal. Roman brides wore the flammeum, a flame-colored veil, and the Latin verb for a woman marrying, nubere, literally means to veil oneself. Roman tombstones show the dextrarum iunctio, 2 right hands clasped, an image so durable it survives in every wedding photograph taken this weekend. A private arrangement became a public claim. A public claim became a contract. A contract became a sacrament. And the sacrament eventually became a $65 online form with a 2-business-day processing window. That last step took a while. For much of medieval Europe, a marriage was legally made by consent alone, 2 people saying the right words to each other, anywhere, with no priest, no witnesses, and no record, which produced precisely the chaos you'd expect, and a great many court cases in which one party insisted the words had been said and the other party remembered the conversation quite differently. The church spent centuries tightening the screws, requiring bans to be announced publicly from the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, and finally, at the Council of Trent in 1563, declaring that a valid marriage required a priest and witnesses. Full stop. 1,500 years into Christianity, the institution finally shipped mandatory 2-factor authentication. And all of it is still sitting in your friend's wedding. The registry is a dowry, itemized, except the negotiated transfer of household wealth now takes the form of a stand mixer. The prenup is ter hatum with better lawyers. Speak now or forever hold your peace is not a romantic flourish. It's a live fraud detection query, the last verbal remnant of the bans, a public database check run at runtime, because for most of history there was no database. The officiant asking, "Do you take this man?" is Hammurabi's contract requirement, wearing a nicer jacket. The father walking the bride down the aisle is the visible ghost of the Neolithic exchange between kin groups, now performed by a man in a rented tux who has been told exactly where to stand. Even the guests are ancient. We call them guests. Historically, they were the point. They are the third parties. They are the witnesses. They are the enforcement mechanism, and they are being fed dinner for exactly that reason. Somewhere in every reception, statistically, there is a modern Gary, the one who didn't RSP, brought an unannounced date, and gave a toast that was 30% about himself. 6,000 years of institutional development, and we still haven't solved Gary. We just gave him a +1. Which brings us back to Denise and her Tuesday through Saturday shift, and her pen. Because the $30,000 party is the new part. The flowers are the new part. The photographer crouching the grass shy is extremely new. The oldest thing in the room, older than the vows, older than the ring, older than every religion that ever claimed to have invented it, is that signature, and the strangers standing around agreeing that it happened. Weddings were never about love. They were about witnesses.